The door opened before the car even came to a full stop. Not because Andrew Cole wanted to get out, but because his wife, Christine, had already reached across him and pushed it open herself. She did it without looking at him, without a single word. Just a hand, a push, and the quiet click of a door swinging wide on a Tuesday afternoon in front of a 12,000 square foot estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Andrew was 34 years old. He had $14 in his personal checking account, a duffel bag in the back seat, and a secret that would have changed everything about this moment if Christine had only known. But she didn't know, and he had made sure of that. He stepped out onto the circular stone driveway, and she said exactly 4 words to him before she put the car back in drive. She said, "Don't embarrass me here." That was it. No argument. No heat. Just those 4 words, delivered the way someone reads a grocery list. Andrew picked up his bag, closed the door, and watched the black SUV roll forward toward the main entrance of her father's home, where 2 staff members were already waiting with umbrellas despite the fact that it wasn't raining. He stood there for a moment, still, quiet, and he looked at the house the way a man looks at something he already knows he will never return to. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who stays until the very end of a story like this, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell, because every week we drop stories exactly like this one. Quiet betrayals, hidden power, and the kind of reversals that make you want to rewind and watch again. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from. We want to know. Now let us get back to Andrew Cole, because this story is only just beginning. Andrew and Christine Hargrove Cole had been married for 6 years. On paper, it looked like a love story. He was a structural engineer with a small firm in Hartford, Connecticut. She was the only daughter of Royce Hargrove, founder of Hargrove Capital Group, one of the most respected private equity firms on the Eastern Seaboard. They had met at a fundraiser in Boston. She had laughed at something he said about the architecture of the venue. He had been genuinely surprised that she found it interesting. They dated for 2 years. He proposed with a ring that cost him 3 months of salary. She said yes in front of her friends at a dinner in Manhattan and posted the photo before he had even put the ring away. Andrew always remembered that, not because it bothered him then, but because later, looking back, it told him something he had chosen not to see at the time. That for Christine, the moment had always been more about the audience than about him. Still, he loved her. He genuinely did. And for the first few years, the marriage worked in the way that most marriages work when both people are still pretending that the version of themselves they showed at the beginning is the version that will stay forever. But people do not stay forever. They reveal themselves slowly, layer by layer. And what Andrew eventually saw underneath Christine's warmth and laughter was something colder and more strategic than he had ever expected from the woman he chose to build a life with. The first real sign came 3 years into the marriage. Royce Hargrove had a company dinner, a private affair at his estate in Greenwich, and he had invited a small group of business associates and their families. Andrew attended the way he always attended these events, quietly, dressed appropriately, saying the right things when spoken to, and staying out of conversations that were not his to join. He had always understood the dynamic. These were Royce's circles, his money, his world. Andrew had no stake in any of it, and he had never pretended otherwise. But at that dinner, one of Royce's associates, a man named Derek Calloway who ran a real estate development group out of Philadelphia, had pulled Andrew into a conversation about load-bearing design on high-rise residential buildings. And Andrew, because this was the thing he actually knew, had talked freely. He had been specific, detailed. He had solved a problem Calloway's team had been fighting with for 6 months in about 12 minutes of conversation. Calloway had looked at him with something close to surprise and said, "Your husband knows what he's doing, Christine." Christine had smiled. But later, in the car on the way home, she had said something that Andrew replayed many times in the years that followed. She had said, You were showing off in there." He had looked at her. I was answering a question. She had looked out the window. "People like Derek Calloway don't need solutions from someone like you, Andrew. They need to feel like they already had the solution." You made him feel small. Andrew had said nothing, because the truth was that Derek Calloway had not looked small. He had looked grateful. But Andrew understood, in that moment, that for Christine, the problem was never about Derek Calloway. The problem was about who Andrew was allowed to be in rooms that belonged to her father. That was 3 years ago, and in the 3 years that followed, a pattern had solidified in their marriage that Andrew had watched form the way you watch ice build on a windshield. Slowly, then all at once, Christine had begun describing him differently in public. Not with cruelty, not with anything you could call out directly, but with that particular kind of dismissal that is more brutal than anger because it does not even bother to be heated. At her friend Opal's birthday dinner in New Haven, she had introduced him as "my husband. He does buildings." At her cousin's wedding in Charleston, she had told the table that Andrew fixes structures when someone asked what he did. And 6 months ago, at a charity gala hosted by Royce's Foundation, she had whispered to the woman seated next to her, a woman she thought Andrew could not hear, that Royce always said I deserved someone with more ambition. Andrew had heard it. He had kept eating. He had kept his face completely neutral. And he had quietly decided something that night that he did not announce, did not dramatize, and did not share with a single person in that room. He had decided he was done. But done, for a man like Andrew Cole, did not mean what it means for most people. Done did not mean screaming. Done did not mean packing a bag in a rage and slamming a door. Done, for Andrew, meant watching, waiting, and making very sure that when the moment came, everything was already in place. Because there was something about Andrew Cole that Christine did not know. There was something about Andrew Cole that almost no one in his current life knew. And it was the kind of thing that, once revealed, would make every single one of Christine's calculations collapse from the inside. What she did not know was that Andrew's father was not the retired schoolteacher in rural Ohio that Andrew had described at the beginning of their relationship. His father was Stanley Cole, Stanley Raymond Cole, known in financial circles simply as Stan Cole, the founder and majority owner of Cole Industrial Holdings, a privately held conglomerate worth, at last valuation, somewhere between $3 and $4 billion with operations in manufacturing, commercial real estate, and energy infrastructure spread across 9 states. Andrew was Stanley's only son, his only child, and for 12 years, Andrew had walked away from that life, from the money, from the name, from all of it, because at the age of 22, he had made a choice that most people would never understand. He had chosen to find out who he was without the weight of his father's fortune telling him the answer. He had built his own career, earned his own salary, lived inside his own means, not because he was ashamed of his father, but because he needed to know, with absolute certainty, that what he built and who loved him was real, that it was his. Christine had never been told any of this. Andrew had watched, carefully and patiently, to see whether she would love the man in front of her or whether she would love the idea of what a man could offer her. And she had answered that question more clearly than he ever could have predicted. She had answered it in a black SUV on a Tuesday afternoon in front of her father's house in Greenwich, Connecticut, when she reached across him and pushed the door open without looking at him. Now the part that changed everything happened 4 days later. Andrew was staying in a rental in Hartford, a 1-bedroom unit he had quietly secured 2 months earlier, because men who play the long game do not wait for the moment to prepare. He had brought almost nothing from their shared home. Just clothing, his personal documents, his laptop, and a small wooden box that his father had given him when he was 19. On the morning of the 4th day, his phone rang at 6:47 a.m. The number was one he recognized immediately. It was Thurston Aldrich, his father's personal attorney and the man who had managed the Cole family's legal affairs for over 2 decades. Thurston never called without a reason. Andrew answered on the second ring. Thurston's voice was steady and controlled, but Andrew could hear something underneath it. The careful weight of a man delivering information that he knew would change the shape of a conversation permanently. Thurston said, "Andrew, I need you to come to New York. Your father passed away 3 days ago. I am sorry that I am only reaching you now. We have been trying your previous contact numbers. There is a reading of the will scheduled for Friday morning. It is important that you are present." Andrew sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor for a long time. He did not cry. "Not yet." He said, "I will be there." And he hung up the phone. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now that says, "I'm still here." Let us see who is truly following this story, because what happens next is the part that nobody saw coming. Not Christine, not Royce Hargrove, not a single person in that room on Friday morning in Manhattan. Stanley Raymond Cole had died at 71 of a cardiac event in his office in Lower Manhattan on a Saturday. He had been working, which surprised no one who knew him. The memorial had already been held privately, according to Stanley's written instructions. No ceremony, no announcement, no press release. That was the kind of man he was. He had spent his entire life building something enormous and had never once needed anyone outside of it to know his name. But the people inside that world, the investors, the board members, the legal architects of everything Stanley had constructed over 40 years, they knew. And by the time Andrew walked into Thurston Aldrich's offices on the 43rd floor of a building on Park Avenue in Manhattan that Friday morning, several of them were already seated in the conference room when he arrived. Andrew had not told Christine where he was going. He had not told her anything since the driveway. She had sent 3 text messages in the 4 days since. The first one said, "We need to talk about the logistics." The second one said, "My father's attorney will be reaching out about asset separation." The third one, sent the night before the reading, said simply, "Don't make this difficult." Andrew had read all 3. He had replied to none of them. Thurston Aldrich was a tall man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of stillness that very senior lawyers develop after decades of sitting inside other people's worst moments. He shook Andrew's hand at the door of the conference room and held it a half-second longer than a formal handshake required. "I am glad you are here," Thurston said, and Andrew understood that he meant it. The room held 7 people besides Andrew and Thurston. The board's lead counsel, 2 senior executives from Cole Holdings, a representative from the family's private bank, and 3 individuals whom Andrew did not recognize, but whose presence told him that whatever was in the document on the table in front of Thurston's seat was not a simple matter. Thurston opened the reading without ceremony. He said that Stanley Cole had updated his will 14 months ago and that the document had been notarized and witnessed in accordance with New York state law. He said that Stanley had left a personal letter for Andrew, which would be delivered privately after the reading. He said that the will's primary directive was straightforward and without condition. The entirety of Stanley Raymond Cole's estate, including all holdings in Cole Industrial Holdings, all real property, all liquid assets, all trust accounts, and all controlling interest in any subsidiary entity, was to pass in full to Andrew Raymond Cole, his only son and sole heir. There were no other named beneficiaries. There were no competing claims. The total value of the estate, as of the most recent independent audit completed 8 weeks prior, was $3,240 million. Andrew did not move. He had known, in the abstract, that this moment existed somewhere in his future. But knowing something exists and sitting inside it are 2 entirely different experiences. Thurston slid a sealed envelope across the table. "Your father wrote this himself," he said. "He asked that you read it alone." Andrew read it in a small private office down the hall from the conference room. He sat in a leather chair by a window that looked out over Park Avenue, and he opened the envelope carefully, the way you open something you know you cannot unopen. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten in his father's dense, deliberate script. Stanley Cole was not a sentimental man, and the letter reflected that. It did not begin with "my son" or "dear Andrew." It began with a single sentence: "You were right to leave." Stanley wrote that he had watched Andrew from a distance for 12 years. Not secretly, not obsessively, but in the way that a man watches something he is proud of and has the discipline not to interfere with. He wrote that he had known about Christine. He had known about Royce Hargrove and the dinners and the way Andrew had been steadily reduced in that marriage. He had not intervened because Andrew had never asked him to and because Andrew had never needed him to. He wrote that the money was Andrew's to do with as he chose, that there were no conditions attached to the inheritance except one, and that one condition was simply that Andrew remember what he had always known, that a man's worth is not determined by the people who finally see it. It is determined by what he does when they don't. The letter ended with 2 words: "Be well." Andrew folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He sat there for a while longer, looking out at the city. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and went back to the conference room to begin the work of becoming one of the wealthiest men in Connecticut. What happened in the 48 hours that followed moved quickly and quietly, the way large things do when they have been carefully prepared. Thurston began the formal legal process of estate transfer. Andrew signed the documents that his father's attorneys had already prepared with the expectation that the reading would proceed exactly as it did. Cole Industrial Holdings had a communications team that issued a brief statement to the financial press on Saturday morning. Not a press release, not an announcement, but a 1-paragraph notification to the relevant trade publications that Stanley Cole had passed and that Andrew Cole, his son, had assumed full ownership and controlling interest in the company. It ran as a footnote in the business section of 2 major newspapers and as a short item on 2 financial news wires. For most of the world, it was nothing. For the world that Royce Hargrove lived and worked inside, it was not nothing at all. The name Cole Industrial Holdings was not unknown in private equity circles. Royce Hargrove knew it. He knew it the way every serious player in that world knew it, as a quiet and enormously powerful private entity that had never needed to make noise because it had never needed to compete for attention. And when Royce Hargrove read the name Andrew Raymond Cole in that Saturday morning footnote, he sat at his desk in Greenwich for a very long time before he picked up the phone. Andrew's phone rang at 11:14 that Saturday morning. The number was Christine's. He let it go to voicemail. She called again at 11:22. He let it go again. The third call came at 11:47 from a number he did not recognize. He answered. It was not Christine. It was Royce Hargrove. Royce's voice was different from the version Andrew had heard at dinner tables and gala events over the past 6 years. The controlled authority was still there, but underneath it was something that Royce Hargrove very rarely allowed anyone to hear. The sound of a man recalculating. Royce said, "Andrew, I think we have some things to talk about." Andrew said, "I think we probably do. But not today, Royce." There was a pause. Royce said, "Christine is very upset." Andrew said, "I know." Royce said, "She made some decisions very quickly. I think she acted out of frustration, and I think, given some time and some perspective, she would want to revisit things." Andrew said, "I understand." And then he said, "But I have meetings to get to. I hope you have a good weekend." And he ended the call. He did not block Royce's number. He did not need to. He had already done everything that needed to be done. Christine's attorney contacted Thurston the following Monday with what was framed as a request for a civil asset conversation. Thurston called Andrew immediately and read him the letter, which was formal and careful and suggested that Christine's legal team had done some research over the weekend and understood, now, exactly who they were sitting across from. Andrew listened to the whole thing. Then he said, "Tell them we will be in touch." He said nothing else. Christine herself sent a text that Monday afternoon that was the longest message she had sent him in the entire 6 years of their marriage. It was 4 paragraphs. It spoke about misunderstandings and stress and the pressure of family expectations. It spoke about how much she valued what they had built together. It used the word love in a way that Andrew noticed had not appeared in any of her previous 3 messages from the week before. He read it once. He read it the way you read a document from someone who has just discovered they signed the wrong contract. Then he set the phone down and went back to the call he had been on with Thurston and the Cole Holdings board when the text arrived. There was one more event. It was the thing that closed the chapter in a way that Andrew had not planned, but that felt, in the end, exactly as inevitable as everything else. Royce Hargrove sat on the advisory board of the Hartford Civic Development Foundation, a nonprofit organization that convened annually to award infrastructure project contracts to firms operating in Connecticut. Andrew's engineering firm, the small company he had built himself over the past 9 years, had been submitted for consideration for a major contract 18 months earlier. The application had been quietly denied. Andrew had always suspected why. Now he knew for certain because one of the board members, a man named Jack Whitmore, whom Andrew had met twice at industry events, and who had the particular decency of a man who recognizes a wrong when he helped commit it, called Andrew's assistant and requested a private meeting. In that meeting, Jack told Andrew directly and without covering his tracks that Royce Hargrove had used his advisory board position to flag Andrew's firm as financially undercapitalized and recommend denial. It was not illegal. It was not even unusual in those circles. But it was the final piece of a picture that Andrew had been quietly assembling for a long time. Andrew thanked Jack for his honesty. He asked 2 questions. He left the meeting with everything he needed. 3 weeks later, Cole Industrial Holdings submitted a formal proposal to acquire Hargrove Capital Group's single largest portfolio asset, a commercial real estate development in downtown Hartford that Royce had been positioning for sale for over a year. The offer was clean, all cash, above market, and came with a 36-hour acceptance window. It was the kind of offer that, in any normal transaction, would have been considered a gift. It was delivered on a Wednesday. By Thursday afternoon, Royce's team had done enough research to understand that the offer was not from some anonymous buyer. It was from Andrew, and it had been structured in such a way that accepting it would require Royce to acknowledge, in writing, as part of the standard disclosure documentation, the advisory board involvement in the denial of Andrew's firm's application. Royce did not accept the offer, but the offer had never really been about the property. It had been about letting Royce Hargrove understand, with complete clarity, exactly how far Andrew Cole's reach now extended and exactly how much patience Andrew had developed over 12 years of building something in silence. The offer expired. Andrew moved on. Cole Holdings acquired 3 other assets in Connecticut over the next 6 months, all of them at fair market value, all of them executed cleanly. Andrew's engineering firm received the Hartford Civic contract on the next cycle, evaluated on its merits by a reconstituted advisory board after 2 members, including Royce, quietly stepped down from their positions. None of this made the newspapers. None of it was designed to. Andrew was not interested in a spectacle. He was interested in outcomes. Christine filed for divorce in October. The proceedings were handled entirely by attorneys on both sides. Andrew's legal team was Thurston Aldrich's firm, which meant that Christine's attorneys spent most of the process understanding the full structure of Andrew's inherited estate, which, under Connecticut law and the terms of a prenuptial agreement that Christine had signed 6 years earlier without reading closely enough, was entirely protected. The prenuptial agreement had been drafted before the marriage at Christine's father's request, intended to protect the Hargrove family assets in the event of a divorce. It had, with perfect irony, also protected Andrew's inherited assets in precisely the same way. Christine received what the agreement specified. Nothing more. The divorce was finalized in December. Andrew signed the papers in Thurston's office on a Thursday morning, returned a single phone call about a board meeting at Cole Holdings, and then drove to a small coffee shop in Hartford that he had been going to for 9 years. He ordered what he always ordered. He sat by the window. He did not feel victorious. He did not feel vindicated. He felt quiet in a way that was very different from the quiet of the driveway in Greenwich. That had been the quiet of a man holding something in. This was the quiet of a man who had set something down. There is one last thing worth telling. His father's letter, the one Stanley had written in his own hand and left in Thurston's office, had a postscript on the second page that Andrew had not shared with anyone. The postscript was 3 sentences. Stanley wrote, "I watched you choose love over money for 12 years. I watched that choice teach you something that the money never could have. Do not let the money make you forget what the choice showed you." Andrew had those 3 sentences in mind when, 2 months after the divorce was finalized, he funded a full scholarship program through his father's foundation for engineering students at 3 Connecticut universities, with priority given to applicants from working-class backgrounds who had built something with their own hands before they ever sat in a classroom. He named the scholarship the Raymond Cole Foundation Award, using his father's middle name because his father would have hated having his own first name on a building. He kept his engineering firm. He did not dissolve it. He expanded it. He hired 12 new engineers in the first quarter of the new year. He kept his office in Hartford. He did not move into the kind of space that people with his level of wealth are expected to occupy. He moved into a slightly better version of the space he already had. He remained, in most of the ways that mattered to him, the man Christine had pushed out of a car on a Tuesday afternoon, with $14 in his account and a secret he had never needed anyone else to confirm. The difference was that now no one would reach across him and push the door open. And if they tried, they would find that the door had already been removed. Because Andrew Cole had learned, over 12 years of deliberate and patient living, that the most powerful thing a man can do is let the people who underestimate him finish their sentence, and then simply show them the room they did not know existed. And that is where we leave Andrew Cole, not in a boardroom, not in a headline, sitting in a coffee shop in Hartford, Connecticut, with what he always ordered, at a window he had been sitting at for 9 years, while the rest of the world figured out what he already knew. If this story hit different for you, if you felt every single turn of that road, then you already know what to do. Like this video, subscribe if you have not already, and leave a comment below with the one word that describes Christine from your perspective. Just one word. We read every single one. And we will see you in the next story, because trust us, the next one is even heavier than this.